All right, hello and welcome back. Today we're going to continue on with our lecture on the Civil War and Reconstruction. We're currently in part 2 of the reading, which is Abolition and the National Politics of Slavery. The last lecture that I had given had covered the topic of the abolition movement. This lecture is going to cover the topic of the national politics of slavery. So, we're going to start out with a map here, as we usually do. Now, the two previous maps that I had shown you were from 1830 and 1850. So why am I showing you a map then that is from 1820 and predates the previous two maps? Well, the reason why I'm showing you this map is because I think it effectively depicts the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Now, a compromise is kind of a give and take. So, if you and your brother, for example, both really wanted to use the car on Friday night, you and your brother may strike a compromise in which you can use the car Friday nights, but your brother gets to use the car Saturday all the way through Thursday. So there is a little bit of give and take. You get the car on Friday night as you want, but you're also willing to give a little as well, and you allow your brother to use the car Saturday through Thursday. So that's what a compromise is. So in the context of the Civil War, or actually the antebellum period, because we haven't reached the Civil War just yet, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 had admitted Maine into the Union as a state in 1820. Now, Missouri also was applying for statehood at that same time. Now, of course, we've talked already about this friction between northern states and southern states over the issue of slavery in Congress. Well, the compromise that had existed was Maine was admitted as a free state and territory, in this case a state. They were applying for statehood. Missouri, however, was going to be admitted as a slave state. So it would be one more free state, one more slave state. And therefore it would keep the balance equal in Congress and keep both the North and South not necessarily happy, but content moving forward. Now, the additional part of this Missouri Compromise of 1820 was this line right here. If you look at it, it reads the Missouri Compromise line. And right next to it says 30 degrees, 30 minutes. That's how you read that. 30 degrees, 30 minutes. And what that is, it's the line of latitude that runs across here. So you've probably in geography had learned about latitude and longitude. Well, the Congress of the United States had determined that any territories that were north of the Missouri Compromise line, and I'm talking not just states, but territories that were north of the Missouri Compromise line, would be closed to slavery by the Missouri Compromise. So you see all this unorganized territory is red, and over here, closed to slavery. Slavery would be prohibited north of that line, with one exception, Missouri. And then south of that line, the territories would be open to slavery. And so that's why you see the Arkansas territory down below the Missouri Compromise line is purple. Purple is open to slavery by the Missouri Compromise. Now, this is important, all this that is depicted on the map. I'm going to come back to this map later on in the lecture. So, a brief introduction. Each time a new state applied to enter the Union, you had another round of heated debates about slavery that would begin in Congress. Some opposed slavery as immoral, although it should be noted, not all opposed slavery on pure moral grounds. Others defended it as constitutionally protected right to property. And this is weird to think, but slaves were not viewed as people. They were not viewed as human beings. Rather, you had enslaved people were viewed by Southern slaveholders as their property. And that's why in that National Black Convention address that we had just read together as a class, you saw that the delegates to the convention, who were the authors, were placing a lot of stress on the word people. We are the people of the United States. We are persons, not things. And they over and over again use the phrase fellow citizens, as if to underscore the fact that we are not property, you are not property. Every person is a human being and should be treated as such. Now, you saw some people in Congress did not oppose slavery as being immoral, being wrong and evil. Some just saw slavery as a threat to white menial labor. That in the South, you had poor white non-landowning males were having trouble getting jobs because they had no education and very few skills, and so they were competing in the job market with enslaved men and women. And so in the South, you had many people had, I shouldn't say many, but some people had opposed slavery not because they viewed it as evil, but rather they just viewed it as a threat to white menial labor, that there was competition in the market. So you had this growing sectional divide that existed between the North and South, and it's only getting larger and larger, and we're leading up to the beginning of the Civil War. You'll notice that the timeline here that I've been listing is getting shorter and shorter. Now, this timeline only represents or illustrates a span of 11 years. We're going to start out in 1850 and then work our way towards 1861, which is where the Civil War starts. So how did slavery contribute to a divide between the North and South? Well, many in the North had felt that the South had too much influence in Congress. So in Congress, what you should know and what you'll learn next year in civics is that the U.S. Senate, every state in the United States gets 2 senators. But in the House of Representatives, representation is not equal. Rather, representation is based on the proportion of the population that resides within your state. Put another way, more populous states get more representatives in the House of Representatives. So you have a state like California today has a lot of people living in it. California is the most populous state in the United States. They get a lot of representatives in the House. But you have a state like Wyoming. There's like 2 dudes and a cow that live in Wyoming. So they only get 1 representative in the House of Representatives. So back to this. Many in the North felt that the South had too much influence in Congress, and they attributed that excessive power to the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution. So in the Constitution, every 10 years, the United States has to perform a census. And I believe we had talked about that earlier on in this course. The census is a count of all of the people in the United States, and in an effort to get demographic data on who's living here, what is the racial makeup, the ethnic makeup, the age makeup, where people living, what kind of jobs are they performing, and just all this demographic data. Well, so for every 5 black slaves that resided in, let's say, South Carolina, they only counted as 3 total people for the population counting purposes. And that matters when determining representation in the House of Representatives. So as the population of enslaved people had grown, so did the number of House representatives of southern states. And so the North's arguing that the South is getting way too powerful, because the slave population keeps growing, but yet these enslaved men and women, they don't get any right to vote. They don't have any rights. How did the proposed entry of California and New Mexico as new states provoke a crisis? Well, since 1812, which was when the War of 1812 had ended, since 1812, Congress maintained the balance between the number of free states and slaveholding states. But when California and New Mexico had applied for statehood, anger had boiled over in Congress. So California and New Mexico, they were territories, and finally enough settlers had resided there that they fill out their application for statehood. But the issue, once again, is, are these states going to be admitted as free states or as slave states? Well, South Carolina and Mississippi, MS is Mississippi, had threatened to secede from the Union over this issue. It got so heated in Congress that you actually have this man right here. I don't know if you can see this clearly, but this man is Senator Henry Foote. And Senator Henry Foote is from Mississippi. He actually pulls a gun on the floor of Congress and had to be wrestled to the ground. So it just gives you an idea of just how heated these debates got. So there were four main competing ideas regarding California and slavery. So I'm going to walk through each one of them. One, you had a very reactionary idea was Congress had no right to make laws to regulate slavery. This is a state-by-state issue. So this, if you find this view, tended to belong to Southern representatives, Southern senators, that very far, deep South representatives. They took on this extreme belief that Congress had no right to make laws because every state should determine whether they are a slave state or a free state. The second competing idea regarding California slavery is that it should be decided by popular sovereignty. White settlers should vote to decide. This idea of popular sovereignty, this is a loaded term. I'm going to break it down for you. So popular comes from the root word people, because if you are a popular kid in school, then a lot of people like you, popular people. And then sovereignty has the word reign in it. To reign is to rule. So rule by the people. It means power to the people. So the second competing idea is that white settlers should vote and decide whether their new state is going to be a free state or a slave state. The third competing idea is that slavery should not be legal anywhere in the United States. This was a very radical idea. This idea that slavery should be abolished altogether. And then the fourth idea was slavery can continue to exist in the South, but should not expand into new territory. So those are the whole spectrum of ideas regarding California and slavery. And not just California, but any new territory in slavery. So what was the Compromise of 1850? We had talked about the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Here's the Compromise of 1850, 30 years later. So this was a series. It wasn't just one law. It was a series of laws. There were 5 laws that were all kind of packaged together and referred to as the Compromise of 1850. These 5 laws were passed to prevent the United States from breaking apart. Now, once again, it's a compromise, so it's a give and take. The North is going to give something, the North is going to get something. The South is going to give something, the South is going to get something. So to appeal to the North, California would be admitted as a free state. So you see green, free state or territory, California in 1850, green state. It resolved the border conflict between Texas and Mexico, which isn't a big deal. We're not really going to talk about that, but that's what this fine line here on the western part of Texas, that comes from the Compromise of 1850. It abolished the trade of enslaved people in Washington, D.C. So you have Washington, D.C. is between Virginia and Maryland. And so no longer in our nation's capital would the trade of enslaved people be legal. But it is important to note it did not abolish slavery itself, just the slave trade. To appeal to the South, the Compromise of 1850 had granted popular sovereignty to determine the legality of slavery in southwestern territories. So in the Compromise of 1820, recall that above that 36-degree, 30-minute parallel right over here, that any territory north would be considered a free state or territory. But now you have a situation where technically Utah over here and parts of this New Mexico territory are falling north of that line, so we're getting to the point where we're about to break that compromise. The most controversial law in the Compromise of 1850, however, was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. So this gave Southern slaveholders a legal tool to capture fugitives who escaped slavery to free states in the North. So prior to this law in 1850, if a enslaved person were to escape their enslaver and run north to a free state, they would achieve their freedom. But in the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 now had determined that slave catchers could go north into free states, recapture these fugitives, and then bring them back south to re-enslave them. So the law had appointed federal commissioners to determine whether fugitives were going to be free or would be re-enslaved. So these federal commissioners would put the fugitive on trial and judge whether the fugitive is going to keep his or her freedom or be re-enslaved. Now, it is important to note that the system tilted heavily against these fugitives. So because commissioners were paid more if they ruled in favor of the slaveholder. So commissioners would get paid $10 if they ruled in favor of the slaveholder, but they would only get paid $5 for their time and for their work if they ruled in favor of the fugitive. So naturally, you saw that this law had empowered slaveholders. Next, how did the Kansas-Nebraska Act create more opposition to slavery? So now we have Kansas and Nebraska territory over here. In previous maps, it was unorganized territory, but in 1854, Kansas and Nebraska are organized as these two territories. They're not states yet, but they're at least organized as Kansas and Nebraska territory. Both territories are north of that Missouri Compromise line of 1820 that divided slaveholding states to the south with free states to the north, except for Missouri, and effectively nullified the compromise and used popular sovereignty. We just talked about that word. It gave people the power to determine whether slavery would be legal. So if you're allowing the people in Kansas or in the people in Nebraska, these white settlers, if you're allowing them to vote to determine whether slavery would be legal in those two territories, then that contradicts the Missouri Compromise of 1820 that said that slavery was going to be prohibited. So now I just want to compare these three maps before we move forward, because I know I had given you three different things here. Missouri Compromise of 1820, Compromise of 1850, and then the Kansas-Nebraska Act. I just want to show you how the nation is developing. So remember, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 admitted Maine as a free state, Missouri as a slave state, and then established this line here, the 36-degree, 30-minute parallel, and said that any territory above that line was going to be a free state or territory, except for Missouri. During the Compromise of 1850, you have Utah and New Mexico received popular sovereignty. So the settlers of Utah and New Mexico would determine whether these two territories would allow for slavery or not. And the give and take there was that California was admitted as a free state. And this is why California in 1850 is orange, but you have Utah and New Mexico are yellow. Decision left to those territories. And then finally, what we just talked about, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now we have Nebraska territory, Kansas territory, and they're yellow, which indicates that the decisions were going to be left to those territories, to those white settlers to determine. So how did the Kansas-Nebraska Act lead to violence then? And well, thousands of white settlers ended up moving to Kansas because if it was going to be left up to popular sovereignty, these thousands of white settlers wanted a say in whether slavery was going to expand westward. So slavery supporters from Missouri, right over here, this is Missouri, were moving west into Kansas territory because they wanted to place their vote in favor of slavery. And then you had abolitionists from New England being the upper east of the United States, were traveling west in order to cast their vote against slavery. So you have these two factions that are about to butt heads and clash. Well, the pro-slavery forces had won the election, even though historians believe that the majority of people that were settled in Kansas at the time were actually against slavery. You had this flood of people coming in from Missouri that ended up rigging the election to win that election in favor of slavery. So in 1856, people on both sides of this debate had committed acts of violence, and this was a period known as Bleeding Kansas because it was so violent and bloody. On one hand, you had 700 slavery advocates had attacked an anti-slavery town known as Lawrence, causing massive property damage. And so you can see right here you have people with guns, and you have buildings being set on fire. And then you also, on the other hand, had abolitionist John Brown, who you might remember from that America, the Story of Us video that we watched in class. John Brown had led a group of followers and attacked pro-slavery Potawatomi, which was the name of the town, and killed 5 people. So all of this violence is happening in the state of Kansas, and this was known as Bleeding Kansas. The last thing we're going to talk about today is a very important case. I talk about it in my law classes because this is one of the landmark cases of United States history. And this was known as Dred Scott versus Sanford. How did the Dred Scott versus Sanford case heighten tensions over slavery? Well, let me give you some background first. Dred Scott, this man, was an enslaved person, and he was brought north into both Illinois and Wisconsin territory by his enslaver, who was actually an army surgeon. And so this army surgeon brought Scott along with his wife and 2 kids north with him. Well, Scott, when he was in a free state in free territory had then filed a lawsuit against his enslaver and argued that because he is now currently residing in a free state, he and his family should be free. This case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States. That's what SCOTUS is in my PowerPoints. So what was the final result? The Supreme Court of the United States rules that Scott was still enslaved despite residing in a free state, and that black people, free or enslaved, could not be U.S. citizens and therefore could not bring a lawsuit in court. The Supreme Court had ruled that enslaved people were property. So to give you some background on the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court, 7 of the 9 justices were appointed by Southern presidents. 5 of the 9 justices that decided this case were slaveholders themselves. So this case was tilted in favor of slaveholders, and sure enough, the Supreme Court ruled that enslaved people were in fact property of their enslavers, and that the enslavers could force them to move wherever they choose, including the North. So if you think about it, this effectively had declared the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which states that any territories that were north of that 36-degree, 30-minute parallel, that line of latitude, was unconstitutional, and said that territories cannot prohibit slavery in the North. So if you think about it, this case had attacked one of the Republican Party's core beliefs, which was that slavery should not expand into new territories. Meanwhile, you had the South had applauded this case because this affirmed their belief that the expansion of slavery was in fact constitutional. All right, I believe that's all I have for you today. Hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time.